Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for what they do to keep the country safe. So, Secretary Taylor, I wanted to follow up on some of the questions that Senator Baldwin had asked. And I would ask all of you to give me some insight on a comment that I heard from our FBI director. I think it's important that the American people understand what we're dealing with in terms of not only Americans but Westerners who have potentially traveled to Syria or have interest in traveling to Syria and joining with one of these extremist groups, including ISIL. So you had testified that more than 100 U.S. persons you're tracking, and you've identified those as those who have intended to go, those who have gone, and some of whom have been actually engaged and killed in this conflict. I note that the FBI director, Comey, said in August, when I give you the number of 100 Americans, I can't tell you with high confidence that it's 100 or 200, that it's 100 or 500, that it's 100 or 1,000 more, because it's so hard to track. Here's a very important question that I think people need to know, and that is, do we really know? And how many of these do we really have track of? And how many don't we have track of?
Senator, I would share the Director Comey's comments in terms of we don't know what we don't know, and I think that's the context in which he was making those comments. I think we have very high confidence on the number that we do know, and we have systems that help us identify more day in and day out. So I could sit here today and give you the number of over 100, and tomorrow it may be based upon our intelligence investigation with the FBI. We'd have more identities that we didn't know about before.
But is the reality that while we have confidence in the 100, that we really don't know how many more may be part of this?
I think that's a fair statement.
I mean, I assume that's why Director Comey, who I certainly have a lot of respect for, made that statement when he was specifically asked about how confident we are in the number of 100.
Well, given homegrown violent extremism, given the nature of how people radicalize, given the nature of the data on the internet, it is very difficult to say with any degree of certainty that we know all that could be wanting to join this particular effort.
So we know that it may be more than the 100 that we're talking about. With respect to the 100 that we do know, do we have track of all of them?
Yes, ma'am. I would defer to my colleagues of the FBI who lead the Joint Task Force looking at this issue for our government.
Senator, if I could address that. So I agree with General Taylor wholeheartedly. I could tell you any individual, and they definitely fit into the three categories that Mr. Rasmussen had talked about, any individual that we can predicate an investigation on, the FBI has an open case on that individual, whether they're abroad or in the United States. We also dedicate an immense amount of resources to covering the individuals that we know about. I can't actually get into all those in this session, but we will in detail in the next session.
Let me ask you, the 100 that we know about, what authorities do we have to revoke their passports? In other words, you're a United States citizen. Obviously, you're entitled to certain rights, but so what can we do to make sure that they can't get back in the community if we believe that they've joined, for example, an extremist group like ISIL, who has brutally and horrifically murdered 2 American journalists?
Sir, that is it's a very complicated question in terms of taking away an American's passport. There are judicial means to do that. I'm not an expert in that, but we can get you the answer of what are the authorities that would allow for that to happen.
Well, I think that's really important because we need to understand we certainly don't want a situation where you all talk to someone, you don't have the authority to detain them. We're in a position where they have to appear before a judicial authority, but in the interim, they're not detained, and they have open access in America. So I would like a follow-up to know what those processes are, what tools you have at your hands when there is obviously evidence that an American is involved with a group like ISIL, so that we can understand whether those authorities are sufficient. So I would appreciate a follow-up on that. I also wanted to ask, what I understand from hearing your testimony today is that you said that the threat of ISIL is really regionally focused, meaning the region of where they're operating in Iraq and Syria and the surrounding regions. What kind of access do they have to financing?
That's been one of our great concerns as ISIL has surged in Iraq, is that they've had the ability to draw on a wider array of sources for financing, including kidnap for ransom, simply occupying and taking over Federal Reserve holdings.
I saw an estimate of they're making at least $1 million a day. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair estimate.
Okay. And as I understand, they have safe havens in Syria, correct?
Yes.
And they're obviously taking over more territory in Iraq, correct? That is their design and one of the reasons, the concerns we have with regard to what's happening in Iraq right now?
That is their ambition in Iraq. In recent weeks, Iraqi security force action in combination with United States military action has stemmed the ability of ISIL to gain more territory.
But they have some territory right now. You would agree with me?
Yes.
They have territory in Syria. They have territory in Iraq. They have a means to make money. And when we think about this threat on the passport issue, it's not just about Americans, right? I know Secretary Taylor, in your testimony, there's about 2,000 Westerners, but I've also seen estimates of 7,500 potential foreign fighters from all different countries that have joined this conflict. Starting in Syria. I don't know how many of those have joined ISIL, but this threat goes beyond thinking about Americans. How good, I know you talked about a good news story about more communication between our other countries with regard to these individuals who have joined these extremist groups. But we also have a visa waiver program with countries like the United Kingdom and France. And so how good is our intelligence and ability to track those individuals? And we talked about the 100, so we're worried about our people, but thinking about the individuals that don't need a visa to come travel to the United States of America, and as I understand it, there's actually thousands. The numbers that the United Kingdom, Great Britain is facing is much greater even than the United States. Can you give us a good assessment of how good a track we have on them and what ability we have to stop them from coming to the United States, or to know exactly where they are so that we don't face a situation where someone is the James Foley video, that individual who committed that barbaric murder, he was clearly from Great Britain. You could tell from his accent. So an individual like that coming to the United States and then participating in an action here. So can you give us a little more insight on that? Because I think it's important for people to understand.
Yes, ma'am. I would defer to Nick to talk about the intelligence cooperation that we have, which is significant with our European partners, and daily we exchange information. But more importantly, visa waiver does not mean people come to this country without screening. Every passenger coming to the United States from outside the United States is screened through our terrorist screening system. And if there is derogatory data, they are not allowed to come to the United States. But
that assumes we have the data, correct?
Well, that assumes we have the data, and that's what intelligence collaboration and cooperation is all about, is making sure that with our partners in Europe and other places that we are getting that data and getting it in a consistent fashion.
So I think this is obviously a very important issue, as well as knowing and tracking who these individuals are who, if we don't have the data, we may just allow them in our country without without being able to stop them from coming. My time is up, but I just want to say one thing that concerns me. What concerns me is I know we've talked today about believing that really the focus on the threat of ISIL is a regional threat, but here we have a sophisticated terrorist organization which our own Secretary of Defense has said is beyond anything that we've seen. And in fact, we have a situation where, you know, Secretary Dempsey described this group as an imminent threat. And we have, combined with, they have financial means to make money, they have territory and some safe havens. We know that in January their leader basically threatened the United States of America. We have seen through their actions with the brutal murders of these two journalists that obviously the threat that they face, the type of barbaric actions they're willing to take against Americans. And then we know that if these people who joined this, if we're not quite sure how many of there are and could return to the U.S., I'm concerned that it's an understatement to say that this is a regional threat in terms of what it might present to us in our homeland.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to just one?
It's just
By
briefly.
using the word regional in my remarks at the beginning, I by no means meant to imply not directed at the United States or U.S. citizens, because certainly today, currently, ISIL has the capability to threaten U.S. persons and interests, not just in Iraq proper, but in surrounding regional states. So our embassies, our personnel, our diplomats, and even non-official Americans are certainly.
But what about here?
As I said, if allowed over time to utilize the safe haven that they currently are enjoying.
So right now you don't think they have that capacity?
Right now, we assess that they do not have active, ongoing plots aimed at the United States homeland.
So that's a different question of whether they have the capacity. We don't know of any active, ongoing threats, but plots, but.
And we do not assess right now that they have the capability to mount an effective, large-scale plot inside the United States.
Large scale, correct.
You know, another piece of this that you can't necessarily account for is are individuals that we talked about under the category of homegrown violent extremists who may self-identify as acting in sympathy with or in support of ISIL, maybe perhaps not even ever having touched ISIL leadership in any kind of command and control way, but in the aftermath of a potential attack, even here in the homeland, might self-affiliate and describe. So I don't mean to, by any means, to minimize the threat to ISIL. That's not my intent. I was simply trying to describe in kind of, in a sense, concentric rings where the levels of concern we have at present versus what we see developing more over time.
Thank you.
There's no doubt that what you described with the foreign fighters is what gives them the capability to threaten the homeland over the longer term.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.